Good morning. Look, I'd like to first acknowledge Jerry and the Indjalandji people from Longreach, and thank you, Jerry, for us coming down here all the time. It's an old tradition that we kind of get welcome into country when we come from other parts. This country down here, from where I am, we call them Nduduru people. That means in the old days they traded pitri, and I've got that on there, so they were bloodsuckers, we called them, and they'd take our kidney out as a payback if we broke law. So, and just a little bit, and also to acknowledge Howard Hobbs, the member for Warrego, and everyone else. Thank you, and Pearl and Jocelyn. I've got to be quick, so I'll rattle through this, I hope, and get it in time. We're the Indjalandji people from right up the catchment, the head catchment of the Georgina River. So all the tributaries that come in from the Georgina, up there, other side Camwell, we're basically the traditional owners from. We had our determination in December last year for our native title determination, and we hold custom to that country and law. And part of our law, and my ancestral line is rainmakers. My uncle and my great-great-grandfather and the grandfather before him were rainmakers. And they used to tee up with all the old fellas from the Sandover and right out from Brudwick and Amaroo and those places, and they used to get together in ceremony time down from what they call Boundary Gully on Indjalandji to sing rain. My father was born under a sacred tree at Lake Nash, and my grandmother's got a tree at Camwell, which they call Murrell, and her country's all Barclay. Can I start now, mate? So I'll just flick through this. That's the Lake Eyre Basin, so I'll move to the next one. Look, I just want to let you know what our first impact. This is coming from a historian called Hudson Firth, and he was the man that first brought 8,000 sheep to the Georgina in 1864. And when those sheep got the smell of the river at night time, they rushed and they hit the river. And along the river was all our mob. There were scores and scores of campfires going, and they went through them people and they scattered them. John Sutherland was the bloke that brought him in, and then, flick on to the next one, and then in 1969 there was a drought from 64 to 67, and then they left that country, and then they come back in 1969, and they started putting cattle on the rivers, and when the droughts hit, they started fighting over water, access to water. And the stories that we have, because our grandfather, my mother's mother's father was there at that time, and there's oral history of it. Her grandmother was bayoneted at Louis Creek on Lawn Hill and then came up the river fleeing from the troopers. And those stories have been passed down from generation to generation, so it's pretty well from my mother to us, from her grandmother. And that fight started over, they started spearing cattle because they wanted to drink too, and there was cattle dying in the waters. And it went from waterhole to waterhole. And basically most of the Bulanda, Wakabanya, and a whole lot of other tribes were totally wiped out. Their systems are all gone, their religion gone. It's one of the things that we don't want to see anymore. It was sad times in those days, and it's something that we don't want to be fighting over is a resource, because my ancestors used to sing that rain, and they used to sometimes sing it for cattlemen. And it's the last thing that we all want to fight over here and now. I think, we've got to start thinking with our heads and working together. Move on, mate. and getting back to this, the impacts on ceremonial and religious life. This was a corroboree that was passed from Camwell down the Georgina. It went across onto to the Hamilton River and finally onto the Diamantina River, because part of that ceremony died out because of the infighting and all the fighting that go along. And that was documented in 1893 right up to 1899, and we know that there's old people still conducting that ceremony. In fact, on the Sandover they still carry that ceremony. But it was shared around to keep people and lines and religious affiliations intact along the Georgina. Next one, please, mate. The trade routes, and some of you would be aware, the Georgina was one of the biggest trade routes in Australia, and it traded pearl shells and shells from up into the Gulf, right up from Arnhem Land, right down into South Australia. And a lot of those places, a lot of that trade is obviously finished, but there's still remnants of trade still going on. Next one, mate. And on trade routes, Pitchery was I was talking about before, down there, Carlo is the most potent pitchery you can get out in the sandhills. And it was traded and fought over. And wife swapping and ceremony swappings and ochre and chisel blades and axes and all that were traded up and down the Georgina River with that mob from that country for that pitchery. It's a narcotic. If you got to know how to doctor it well so that you don't go silly on it. A lot of old people still chew it. There is another source of it in the McDonnell Ranges, which you would call mulva, and that's a tobacco they chew with. And the best ashes, they mix it with ash. The best ashes are along the Georgina. They traded that ashes everywhere as well. Okay. We're talking about one river system now, and we've completed 2 studies along with the University of Queensland, and we had a grant from Southern Gulf to do traditional ethnological knowledge along the Georgina up at Camwell, and basically we provided an overview on the environmental significance and historical values in modern day use, taking into consideration the old day use and the current traditional owner concerns regarding issues affecting the river area, such as impacts from pastoralism, tourism, feral animals, weeds, erosion and sedimentation. And it's like our mate said, our biggest problem right now is that red claw. They were just grabbing buckets loaded from other Georgia and chuck them in the back of the motor cars in the 2009 floods. You know, they were just, and they turned the water muddy. It's starting to get really muddy up there. Next one, mate, please. So what we're trying to preserve is all our cultural sites along the river system. The Georgina River is one of the most biggest archaeological sites, probably, we'll say the world, but we don't want to big note ourselves, but probably from about 10 k's on either side of the river and right up the river for 60 k's right up on the Northern Territory border is one big quarry site where they traded all those artefacts down the Georgina and across the continent, along with the Calcadine axes that the Calcadine traded. Next one, mate. And then we're also studying bush foods, flora and fauna. So we've got another grant from AERC that looks at documenting all the knowledge about plants on the Barkly Tablelands and the Georgina River system. So we're working with the University of Queensland to do that. Next one. And there's 130 different species of birds along the Georgina River up that end. We've just recently seen pink-eared ducks and speckled ducks come in for the first time, so probably because the rain's up there and there's been nothing down the river. The fieldwork recording traditional ethnological knowledge is undertaken by our Aboriginal Corporation, and the researchers are from the University of Queensland. And we're teaching, we run a training program in Camwell for 33 students twice a year for the mining company. So the elephant I kind of ride a little bit because we need them to, they're the biggest employer of Indigenous people, so we've got to ride that elephant to get our people into jobs. And we take them out and teach them all about the river system. And we're also working with stakeholders and current for mainstream studies concerning the Mount Isa City Council and pastoralists on that area. Where the ethnobotanical is going outside the river system, so all the known plants and species of plants, and recording the species that are not there anymore, that we know in our traditional knowledge. And we also have those cultural teaching values when we get those trainees in, because they're all over Queensland. I've got a young chap now travelling with me from Arakun, and we have a relationship with Rio Tinto up there that we train all their hardcore trainees to put them into work at Rio. And we also document the impacts in the dry season, the next one, and the impacts in the wet season. So we have staff that go out and do all that documentation. And the current impacts on multiple users. One of the big things about our area is tourism. Can we go to the next one? Cheryl, no, next one after that, 5 minutes. It's tourism, because there's 300 of them that go along the Georgina River, and they're just knocking all the banks and beds in on the river, and just go to the next one, and litter and waste, and they drop all the grey water in the river system because there's no facilities. The next one is our second river system, and it's the underground river system. That's there. In 1916 drought, they'd started drilling bores on Rocklands, and I was a boreman on Rocklands, and we had to reline a bore in Mudgee, and I went back and got the old records because it was a hanging casing, and we couldn't pull it out, so we had to reline it, and then we didn't know how deep it is. We went down 600 foot. And when they first drilled it, the water came up within a couple of metres of the top, and now you've got air coming out of it from the cave system, but the water in there's 300 foot of water, and they were made 550,000 years ago, and pretty well like you've seen the thing on TV the other night with the Nullarbor, where those big caves are underneath. And these are the threats to our river system. One of the things that we have a real concern is the proposed amendments to the Georgina River, Diamantina River, Wild Rivers Declaration, because along the Georgina, some of these sinkholes actually are on the Georgina and the Narani Creek, which fills up with water, and they fill up the underground systems. And till today, the cave divers say that it's one of the biggest cave systems in the world. And this is what it looks like under there. There's little animals that live under there that haven't seen man before. There's frogs, and there's a species of shrimp, but they've only just started going into this stuff. It's one of our sacred. These are our sacred sites. We call them Winnianwood. They used to be the little descendants of rough-tailed goanna who belonged to that big lizard that used to live there all those years ago. I think it was 6 metres long, and he was a goanna at that time, that fella. But that's his place, and Willie means place, and Muru means that big lizard. Next one, mate. Probably can't see these real well, but that's started the water system at about 80 metres. Next one. That's one of the pools there. So that's how big the cavities are in there. They're pretty big. They're like probably as big as this building, the whole building. The next one. That's them kind of in one of the big cavities. You have to turn the lights off to see some of these. They're good. Next one. And that's underground. So that's a snorkeler going underground. He's in water. They're swimming. And those, as far as they know so far, and the caves keep going, is 36 kilometres long and wide. Next one. So that's a better picture. They're crazy, these fellas, but mate, I wouldn't be doing it. But they're amazed by the kind of elaborate systems that are under there, and that's where you get all your Barclay Tablelands water from. Some of those are probably, he said, between 100 metres and 150 metres deep. Some of those cavities down there full of water. And that's the cave system out at Camwell. So it's a pretty big cave system. I think there's about 180 sites of sinkholes, and they go right down to Alpalulum and then Lake Nash, and right back up onto the fall up above where the Gregory and the Georgina meets. And that's some of the cavities that are there. They've mapped. And then and as Scott said, we're the auspicing body for the Land and Sea Ranger programs, and we've built a program together for them under the CALM Cert 1 and the Cert 2. But again, the elephant comes in the room where we've tied in a lot of mining companies, because one of the things that covers is workplace health and safety, remote workers being away, four-wheel drive training, how to use two-ways, emergency first aid, working at heights, working in confined spaces. It covers all those because they're the competencies that they need to be away on any given site in Queensland under the workplace health and safety laws. And we're trying to make sure that we abide by all those rules and regulations like we try to do with all this Water Act stuff. And that's an outline of the program. It goes for 3 months, so we're going to break them in a bit while they're there. And we've just recently had a meeting with National Parks and Wildlife to start implementing them into the national parks out here to start them working, and then later on start moving out to property. So if you've got properties out there that you've got and want people on to do some work with, well, we can be contacted and we can sit down and have a yarn. Thank you.